It was a rainy day, and the sound of heavy drops filled the busy avenue. No one seemed to notice the old woman who walked slowly along the sidewalk, trying to protect herself from the cold under an old coat full of patches and worn boots that could barely stand the puddles of water. With trembling hands, she held a piece of paper, where she read the instructions carefully and looked around until she stopped in front of a luxurious restaurant. "This is it," she murmured, sighing with relief. She watched the customers who came and went, all well-dressed, with satisfied expressions, and took a deep breath before opening the door. The place shone with elegance, and the shiny furniture seemed destined for someone of high class. As soon as she crossed the entrance, she was approached by the receptionist, who looked her up and down. "Sorry, you must have come to the wrong place," said the woman, trying to keep a forced smile. "Please leave the restaurant immediately." The old woman, with a calm look, replied, "Dear, I reserved a table here." She had been waiting for this moment for years. She would only leave after she had done what she had come to do. The receptionist, named Larissa, hesitated upon hearing the old woman's answer and looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and disdain. "Did you reserve a table? Here?" She let out a short, sarcastic laugh. "This is an elite restaurant. People like, well, with all due respect, people like you don't usually go to places like this." Helena stood firm. "I didn't come here to bother anyone. I just want to see the owner of this restaurant." Hearing this, Larissa rolled her eyes and called the security guard. A tall, robust young man named Lucas approached, crossing his arms. "Is there a problem here?" "She says she reserved a table, but look, it's clear that this isn't the place for her," Larissa explained in an irritated tone. Lucas looked at the old woman for a moment, confused, but asked politely, "Do you have any document confirming the reservation?" With a serene smile, Helena took an envelope from her pocket and, after a few seconds, handed a piece of paper to Lucas, who confirmed the authenticity of the reservation. Larissa and Lucas looked at each other, perplexed. Lucas reluctantly signaled for her to continue, but it was clear that the evening would not be easy. Helena walked forward, feeling the suspicious looks of everyone around her. Each step echoed in the room, and the customers who noticed her whispered and exchanged disapproving glances. Her humble clothes stood out in an environment where the guests flaunted luxurious clothes and expensive accessories. She moved forward, determined, and climbed the long stairs that led to the upper floor. When she got there, she found a room decorated with opulence, tables covered with white tablecloths and flower arrangements, and hurried waiters serving sophisticated dishes. It wasn't long before one of the guests, in a shiny dress, looked her up and down and commented loudly, "What is this? A homeless shelter?" The woman's laughter echoed through the room, and others began to murmur, fueling the humiliation. Helena tried to maintain her composure, but the contempt around her seemed to grow. A nearby man pointed at her and asked the waiter sarcastically, "Has this turned into a charity house?" As Helena endured the stares and laughter, she focused on the reason for her visit. Despite the humiliations, she would continue to stand firm until she reached those in need. Helena felt her heart sink with each cruel comment, but she took a few more steps until she saw what she was looking for. A wide, ornate door that led to the restaurant owner's office. One of the waiters, seeing the uncomfortable scene, muttered to a colleague, "She's just an old lady." The young waitress shook her head in disapproval. "I can't stand seeing this kind of thing," Clara whispered. "I'm going to talk to the director." A more experienced waiter tried to stop her. "Clara, don't go. This kind of customer brings in a lot of profit. Don't risk your job for someone you don't even know." But Clara stood her ground. "There are more important things than money," she muttered, and headed for the office. Meanwhile, Helena tried to ignore the whispers and stares when a drunk man approached with a mocking smile. "Come on, ma'am, how about entertaining us? Sing or dance for us." He began to clap his hands, encouraging the rest of the group, and the laughter grew louder. Helena closed her eyes, trying to bear the humiliation as discreet tears rolled down her wrinkled face. However, before she could respond, the office door opened and a tall, well-dressed man appeared, watching the scene with a stern look. The man, who was now watching the scene with a rigid expression, was Eduardo, the owner of the restaurant. His imposing presence caused the laughter to gradually dissipate as the guests regained their composure. Eduardo frowned and walked over to the table. Center of the room, staring at everyone around him. "Gentlemen, what's going on here? Is everything okay?" His voice echoed through the room, causing a slight discomfort in those present. Helena, who still had tears in her eyes, raised her face, and upon seeing him, froze. It was Eduardo, her son, whom she hadn't seen in decades. "My son," she murmured softly, almost like a sigh. Eduardo didn't recognize the lady in front of him. Instead, he approached the guests who had called him, trying to understand what had caused the commotion. One of the men made a dismissive gesture in Helena's direction and commented, "Eduardo, she clearly doesn't belong here. We don't want this situation here." Eduardo, without blinking, quickly agreed. "I understand. Let's settle this now. Madam," he turned to Helena, "please come with me." Helena felt a tightness in her chest, but at the same time, a spark of hope appeared. Was it possible that Eduardo, her son, had recognized her during that conversation? Eduardo led Helena to a private room, closing the door behind them. He watched her for a moment, trying to understand the reason for her presence there. Helena took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Eduardo, I know you don't recognize me. It's me, Helena, your mother." Those words came out soft, but charged with emotion. Eduardo looked at her, surprised, and laughed in disbelief. "My mother? Is this some kind of joke? My mother died many years ago." He shook his head, clearly uncomfortable. "I don't know what you mean by this, ma'am, but don't lie to me." Helena felt her heart break, but she remained firm. "Eduardo, listen. When you were little, I had to leave you. It was the most painful decision of my life. I couldn't help it. I was sick and no one could take care of you while I recovered. When I went back to the orphanage to get you, you had already been adopted. I spent years trying to find you." Eduardo interrupted her, irritated. "And you think you can come back now, after all these years, as if nothing had happened?" "Please, Eduardo, just give me a chance to explain. I didn't come here for forgiveness. I came because I needed to see you one last time," she begged, tears in her eyes. Eduardo hesitated, shaken by Helena's words, but he still resisted believing that woman who claimed to be his mother. Eduardo took a deep breath, trying to remain calm in front of that woman who claimed to be his mother. He crossed his arms, looking at her coldly. "So you abandoned me because you were sick? I spent years wondering why. I grew up waiting for someone who never came, who left me with strangers." Helena lowered her gaze, feeling the guilt weigh on her shoulders. "I know, Eduardo. I know what you must have been through, but you have to understand, I had no choice. I was between life and death. I was alone, with no family to take care of you. It was the worst moment of my life, and what I wanted most was to have you back. You say that now, but where were you all this time? Just because you've decided to look for me now, do you think you can fill the years of emptiness?" he said bitterly, unable to hide the pain in his voice. Helena took an old photo from her pocket, yellowed by time, and handed it to Eduardo. In the image, a small boy with a shy smile looked at the camera, and next to him was Helena, young, with a loving sparkle in her eyes. "This photo is the only thing I kept. Every night I looked at it and prayed to meet you one day." Eduardo remained silent, looking at the photo, his feelings conflicted. For the first time, he began to consider that perhaps that woman was telling the truth, but the wounds of the past were still too deep. Eduardo continued to stare at the photo in silence, the memories of his lonely childhood beginning to emerge. He felt a mixture of anger and sadness, but something about that woman touched a deep place in his heart, a distant memory that he would rather forget. "That photo," he murmured, still without looking away. "I vaguely remember that day, but it doesn't erase what I went through." He looked at Helena, the pain visible in his eyes. "Do you have any idea what it's like to grow up believing you were abandoned?" Helena approached him, her hands shaking, but her voice firm. "I know that nothing I say will undo your pain, Eduardo, but I never abandoned you by choice. When I was discharged from the hospital, I ran to the orphanage, but you had already been adopted. Since then, I've lived each day with this guilt. hoping that one day you would understand. Eduardo sighed, still reluctant to give in. And what do you expect now? That I forgive you? That I forget all these years? Helena, with tears in her eyes, answered softly, I don't expect anything, my son. I just wanted to see you one last time, to know that you're okay, that you've grown up and built your life. I needed the chance to explain to you, even if you never forgive me. The sincerity in Helena's words finally touched a chord in Eduardo, who, although confused, began to lower the barriers he had kept since childhood. Eduardo took a deep breath, feeling the weight of those words settle in his chest. He didn't know what to think. The conflicting feelings confused him. Part of him wanted to expel her, but another part, softer and almost forgotten, wanted to believe her. I don't know what to say, he murmured, looking away. I spent years trying to ignore all of this, living without looking at the past, without thinking about the absence that was always there. Helena watched him, noticing the internal struggle he was facing. She approached cautiously and placed a delicate hand on his shoulder. Eduardo, I don't want to hurt you any more than I already have, even if unintentionally. I know I'll never be able to make up for the time you spent alone. I just want you to know the truth. He sighed, and for the first time, a fraction of softness crossed his gaze. What if I believe you? What if it's true? Will that change what I've lived, what I've felt? Helena, holding back tears, shook her head. No, I know it won't. But maybe someday you'll be able to remember that your mother never gave up on you, that even in the darkest moments I loved you. Eduardo remained silent, the wall of distrust slowly beginning to break. For the first time, he considered the possibility that she could really be the mother he'd always wanted to have. The silence between them seemed to carry years of pain and unspoken words. Eduardo felt vulnerable, something he avoided at all costs. But when he looked at Helena, he saw the suffering marked on her face, something that only time and longing could cause. Why now? He asked, still hesitant. If you've always wanted to meet me, why did you wait so long? Helena wiped away a tear that had escaped discreetly. It took me a long time to track you down. After I found out you were adopted, no one gave me any more information. I kept looking for you, knocking on the wrong doors, and many times I thought I would never see you again. She took a deep breath, gathering the courage to continue. A year ago, I met a woman in the park. She knew someone who helped find families for adopted children, and it was through her that I found you. Eduardo ran his hand over his face, taking it all in. Have you been looking for me all these years? She nodded with a sad smile. Yes, and I lived with the hope that somehow you were okay. For a moment, Eduardo lowered his head, conflicted. Part of him wanted to remain resentful, but another, growing stronger, longed for a relief that perhaps only reconciliation could bring. He looked at Helena, more human than ever. Eduardo sighed deeply, as if trying to release years of resentment that he had kept bottled up inside his chest. Finally, he looked at Helena with a softer expression, almost like that of a child searching for answers. I thought you never cared, he confessed, his voice low and hoarse. In all those years, I imagined that you had simply forgotten me, that you preferred to move on with your life without looking back. Helena moved a little closer, and her hands, although old and trembling, remained surprisingly firm as they held his. I never moved on, Eduardo. Every day was a reminder of your absence, and deep in my heart, I held the hope that maybe one day you would forgive me. Eduardo looked away for a moment, as if he needed to process it all. It was a lot to take in, but when he looked at Helena again, there was something different in his eyes, a mix of tenderness and understanding, as if her words had finally broken through the barriers he had erected throughout his life. I don't know if I can forgive completely, Mom, but I think I can try to understand. His voice wavered, but it was sincere. Helena smiled, tears of relief and joy in her eyes. That means everything to me, Eduardo. For a moment, they both remained silent, just absorbing the weight of that timid reconciliation. Eduardo, still shaken by the revelations, loosened his grip on his emotional barriers a little. Finally, he asked in a lighter tone, "And where have you been living all this time?" Helena sighed and with a slight smile explained, "After losing the family home, I ended up living in a small room. Not very comfortable, but I always thought I didn't need much. Having you in peace was always what I wanted most." Eduardo seemed to reflect on this, as if he were seeing for the first time the simple and difficult reality of the life his mother led. There was something he had never understood until that moment: the sacrifice, the loss, and above all, the love that was still there, in every word she said. He then looked at Helena, and suddenly, she felt the need to make up for the years she had spent in silence, waiting and rooting for him. "Come with me," he said, surprising himself with his offer. "You deserve some comfort after everything you've been through." Helena hesitated, her eyes revealing a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "Eduardo, you don't have to do this." "I know," he interrupted, "but I want to. It doesn't erase the past, but maybe we can start from here." She nodded, a gleam in her eyes that Eduardo would never forget. Eduardo took Helena's coat, placing it over her shoulders with unexpected care. They left the restaurant, and he helped his mother down the stairs, the gentle gesture saying more than any words he could have said. Helena looked around, noticing the looks of curiosity and surprise from the others, but this time, she didn't care. Beside her was her son, something she had long dreamed of, but never imagined would come true. As soon as they got to the car, Eduardo opened the door for her to get in and sat down next to her. In the silence of the journey, Helena watched the city pass by through the window, remembering all the difficult times she had gone through alone. Now, with Eduardo by her side, she felt as if a cycle was finally coming to an end. They arrived at an elegant building, and Eduardo led Helena to the apartment. She looked around, surprised by the spacious and well-decorated space, so far from her simple reality. Eduardo watched her in silence, seeing the expressions of surprise and admiration on her face. "This is your home, for as long as you want, mother," he said with gentle firmness. "I know life has been hard on you. Maybe it's time for you to have some peace." Helena, moved, looked at him, and for the first time allowed herself to believe that a new chapter was beginning. There, in that apartment, she finally felt at home. In the days that followed, Helena adapted to the new environment, still surprised by the sudden change in her life. Eduardo visited her whenever he could, and each meeting revealed a little more about the lives that the years had separated. He was beginning to know her beyond the woman who had faced so many adversities. Now he saw the loving mother that time had stolen from him. One quiet evening, Eduardo brought out a box of old photos that he had saved over the years, memories of his childhood, adolescence, and adult life. They sat together on the couch, and Eduardo showed each photo to Helena, narrating the memories behind each image. For him, it was a way of sharing the moments that she had lost. For Helena, it was like recovering fragments of a life that she had dreamed of following. When he reached a particularly special photo, Eduardo hesitated. It was a picture of her graduation, with a lonely but determined look. Helena held the photo tenderly, and with a light touch on his hand, said, "I am so proud of you, Eduardo. Everything you have achieved, even without me being there." Eduardo looked at her, and for a moment, all the hurt seemed to dissolve. He finally understood that her love had withstood all the years, intact. "Thank you, Mom. I think I finally understand how much you fought for me." At that moment, mother and son felt that despite their wounds, they were finally rebuilding the connection that time had almost denied them. A few months passed, and the relationship between Eduardo and Helena grew stronger. Between laughter and shared stories, they rediscovered a love that had always been there despite everything. Eduardo, once a man focused only on his career, now found a new purpose in taking care of his mother and filling the years of separation with meaningful moments. On a sunny afternoon, they walked together through the park, a place where Helena used to go during her years of loneliness. Eduardo watched her with admiration and respect. Each step beside her seemed like a new promise that they would never be apart again. "I thought I would never have this chance," Helena confessed, holding his hand. "But now that I'm here, I know it was all worth it." Eduardo smiled, squeezing her hand affectionately. Me too. We can't change the past, but we can build a present that honors everything. We've overcome. Back at the apartment, Helena looked at Eduardo with a sparkle in her eyes. Thank you, my son, for giving me a family again. Eduardo hugged her, and with tears in his eyes said, It's you who gave me this, Mom. It's always been you. In that hug, they both felt that they were finally at peace. The past could not be undone, but the future still offered them a new journey, this time together.